Hello, friends, and welcome back to our virtual Tikkun Leil Shavuot again this year. In some ways, it's nice to see you again in this way. In some ways, it hurts my heart just a little bit that for another year, this wonderful event, that we can't be together. I have high hopes for next year and high hopes that this year will bring lots of togetherness as we just know so much more and we have so much more hope in vaccines and in science than we did last year. In some ways, though, this feels like we need a little bit of a wake-up before we start learning together. So before we do that, let me introduce myself. My name is Rabbi Scott Roland. I have the honor of serving Congregation Shaarey Tikvah, just on the other side of the highway from where I'm sitting now in Beechwood. For the past 5 years, and excited to be teaching Torah and joining this wonderful event again this year. I'm going to be talking about the experience of revelation, the experience at Mount Sinai, with an eye toward thinking about the experience that we have of revelation each and every year, and the opportunity to experience revelation each and every moment of each and every day. So with that, it feels like maybe we've been sleeping a little bit this past year, but it's time to awaken. It's time to awaken ourselves to spring. It's a time to awaken ourselves to new possibilities, the hope of the future. And so I thought it would be nice for us to begin by singing a little nigun together, just to get us in the mood. Yammai da 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 ya da 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 ya da 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 Yammai da 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 ya da 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 Yammai da 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 ya da 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 ya da 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 Yammai da 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 Ani yeshena veli bier kol dodi dofek pitchi li Ani yeshena veli bier kol dodi dofek pitchi li. These beautiful words from the Song of Songs. I was sleeping, but now I'm awake. The voice of my beloved knocks. This is the season where the voice of the divine is calling to each and every one of us, knocking, and it's time for us to answer the door. It's time for us to awaken ourselves to the possibilities of revelation, the possibilities of learning that this sacred night brings with it as we prepare for Shavuot. I want to talk this year about the experience of revelation. Revelation itself is extremely complicated. It's complicated because our tradition tells us, just like it teaches that we have an obligation every year to act as if we were slaves in Egypt that have been freed by God, freed from Pharaoh by God, as if each and every one of us crossed the Sea of Reeds. Well, so too do we believe that each and every one of our souls, whether we are alive, whether we are not, even the souls of those who are Jews by choice, are there at Mount Sinai at the moment of revelation. And if all of our souls were there, it even complicates things more to consider that we all experience different things, that revelation is subjective, that revelation is complicated, that revelation is varied, and that it's ongoing. So I want to speak about the experience of revelation, share some of those varied sources from our tradition, with the hope that it will open the doors for us to experience and be open to our own moments of revelation this Shavuot. It should be flashing up on the screen at some point, or have flashed up on the screen at some point. You can follow along with my source sheet at bit.ly/reports from Sinai, bit.ly/reports from Sinai. So the Torah tells us in the book of Exodus, וכל העם רואים את הקולות ואת הלפידים ואת קול השופר ואת ההר עשן Vayar ha'am v'yanu v'yamdu merachok. All of the people, my translation here says, witnessed the thunder and lightning, but we saw the thunder and the lightning. We'll talk a little bit about how our sages interpreted that. Saw as well the blare of the shofar and the mountain smoking, and when people saw it, they fell back and stood at a distance. The first report comes from about the 4th century of the Common Era, from the Mechilta de Rabbi Yishmael, which is a halachic commentary on the book of Exodus. And it says, V'chol ha'am ro'im, and all the people saw the sounds of sounds and the flames of flames. How many sounds were there and how many flames were there? The intent is that each according to his power, to absorb what he experienced. That is to say, the voice of the Lord in power, the voice of the Lord in majesty. We know these words from Psalm 29, which Kol Adonai b'koach, Kol Adonai b'hadar. Variantly, and all the people saw, to apprise us of the exalted of Israel. When they all stood at Mount Sinai to receive the Torah, as soon as they heard the pronouncement, they assimilated it. And as it is written in the book of Devarim, chapter 32, verse 10, he encircled him, he invested him with understanding. As soon as they heard the pronouncement, they assimilated it. Rabbi Eliezer says, to apprise us of the exalted state of Israel. When they all stood at Mount Sinai to receive the Torah, there were no blind ones among them. And all the people saw, and whence is it derived that there were no mutes among them? From all the people answered together, the Torah says in Exodus chapter 19, verse 8. And whence is it derived that there were no deaf ones among them? From the same place, chapter 24, verse 7, in that the Lord has spoken, we shall do and we shall hear, na'aseh v'nishma. And whence is it derived that there were no lame ones among them? From the same place, verse 17, and they stood at the foot of the mountain. And whence is it derived that were no fools among them? From Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 35, you have been shown to know, etc. So what is this text teaching us? We are all there, all of our souls experiencing the moment of revelation, and yet we all heard, we all experienced it in our own way. Each and every one of us heard according to our power. As God gave us the Torah, we accepted it, we internalized it in a way that each and every one of us could. In some ways, it's a beautiful tale of accessibility. It's a reminder to us that we need to make Torah, we need to make Jewish learning, we need to make our communities, our institutions, even our homes accessible to all. How wonderful would it be to imagine the blind and the deaf and the disabled and all of those among us able to participate, able to understand, able to be in that moment of receiving words of Torah, of accepting words of Torah, in being able to be in our classrooms, to be in our communities, learning together. There were no barriers when it comes to revelation, and this teaches us that there should be no barriers when it comes to building our communities today. For revelation is ongoing. Revelation we accept each and every year on the holiday of Shavuot, and revelation each and every day as God creates and recreates the world before our very eyes. This is easy to see. All we have to do is look outside in the springtime and see the world being recreated for us. That we should do so in such a way, we should make way for all of those, no matter their ability or disability, to be able to participate in the holy work of Torah learning. So in our first text, just as a reminder, we have this sense that revelation is for everyone, and that each and every one of us relates to revelation in and of its own way. What was the experience of revelation? The experience was different for each and every one of us, and that's a magnificent, beautiful thing. And so when someone else has a different experience of revelation, or when someone else has a different understanding of Torah, we have a responsibility to lean into their understanding, to try to understand and to internalize their understanding of Torah, because that too is a part of the revelation at Mount Sinai. Our second text brings us to another halachic midrash called the Sifrei on Parshat Ha'azinu, a little bit earlier of a midrash from the 3rd century of the Common Era, on the book of Devarim, on the book of Deuteronomy. And this midrash goes through word by word of a verse that we mentioned in our previous midrash. This is Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 10. He found them in a desert region, in an empty, howling waste. He engirded them, watched over them, guarded them as a pupil of his eye. It goes through word by word and explains exactly what this midrash, how this midrash understands the verse. When the verse says that God found them in a desert land, who is the them? Of course, this refers to us. This refers to Israel, as it's written in the book of Hosea, as grapes in the desert I found Israel. And what does it mean when the verse says, and in a wasteland, howling and desolate? It means that we were in a place of afflictions, invaders and marauders. We were in Egypt, and then we found ourselves wandering in the desert. We didn't have the safety, we didn't have protection. God was able to provide those things for us. And this year especially, we might feel in this moment like we've been in a bit of isolation, for some of us desolation, loneliness, a bit of a wasteland perhaps, a place of afflictions, a world that doesn't exist the way that we know the world can be. And in those moments, that's where God finds us. The verse says he surrounded them before Mount Sinai. And you shall set, we read in Exodus 19:12, as we're preparing for Revelation at Mount Sinai, and you shall set bounds to the people round about, saying. And the verse reads, he invested them with understanding. What is the understanding with which the divine invested us? With the 10 Commandments. We are hereby taught that the word left the mouth of the Holy One, blessed is God, and Israel perceived it, and knew how many midrashim it contained, how many halachot it contained, how many leniencies and how many stringencies were with each utterance from the divine at Mount Sinai, how many gezerot shavot, how many parallel identities from similar words it contained. And as we heard each and every one of these commandments, the Midrash tells us they went forward 12 mil and recoiled 10 mil at each commandment. And we were not deterred, neither by the sound of the shofar blasts, nor by the sound of the flashes. So our second Midrash describes a tense moment. Here we are, we're wandering in the desert, we're camped out at Mount Sinai, and we're lonely, and we're battered. We have not regained our strength from slavery, and certainly not regained our strength from the panic at the Sea of Reeds. And yet we desire intimacy. We desire knowledge of the Holy One of Blessing. This one that appeared to us at the Sea of Reeds now appears to us and is telling us what our new relationship is going to be based upon. If we remember back to the story of Passover, the story of the Exodus, Moses says to Pharaoh, send forth my people that they may serve me. It's not that we wanted to be free of everything and anything. As Bob Dylan said, it may be the devil or it may be the Lord, but you're going to have to serve somebody. This is not freedom to do what we want. This is a freedom that we're experiencing to serve the King of Kings, the Holy Blessed One, and no longer to be in service to Pharaoh, a king of flesh and blood. And we feel this intensely, and we want to experience intimacy with the divine. That intimacy means that when we are in our darkest places, when we're in that howling and desolate land, God surrounds us, but there are boundaries. We know that we shouldn't be too far away, and we also shouldn't be too close. And that there's an intensity, the Midrash tells us, commenting, of course, on the end of our verse, which reads that we stood from afar, right? When we saw the the thunder and the lightning, we fell back and we stood at a distance. The Midrash tells us that it hit us so intensely, this moment of revelation, that we were forced back 12 mil, and then we came back to hear more. And then we were forced back another 12 mil, and then we came back so that we could hear more. And we weren't deterred by the sound of the shofar or by the flashes of the lightning. We kept coming back for more because we were so desirous of being in this intense relationship with the divine. So just to review, our very first midrash that we looked at, we each heard revelation in our own way. There were no barriers to revelation. In our second midrash in Sifrei Ha'azinu, it's about our desire to build intimacy and to be in an intense relationship with the divine. Let's look at a third account of revelation from our tradition. This one is a little bit later. It comes from Shir HaShirim Rabbah, from the Midrash on the Song of Songs, not a halachic midrash as the first two that we looked at. Shir HaShirim Rabbah is a relatively late text. It probably came together around the same time as the Talmud, perhaps around the 6th century of the Common Era. And there's certainly texts that are part of it that were added to it later that are maybe even as late as the 9th century of the Common Era. And anyone who's ever read Shir HaShirim, which hopefully we all have, it's traditional that we read Shir HaShirim during Sukkot, knows that Shir HaShirim begins with this beautiful verse, Yishakeni minishikot pihu, that God should kiss us with the kisses of the divine mouth. And Rabbi Yochanan responds to this verse and says, what does it mean? Let him kiss me with the kisses of his mouth. It means that an angel would take each utterance, each revelatory statement from the divine that came from the Holy One of Blessing, would take each and every one of those and would take it around to each and every Israelite and say, do you accept this utterance upon you? Let me tell you a little bit about it. Such and such rules are in it, and such penalties are in it. Such and such decrees are in it. Such commandments, such rulings from minor to major. Such granting of reward is in it. So the angel would be our teacher, and the angel would say to us, this is the commandment that the Holy One of Blessing is trying to give you in this moment. Do you accept it? And of course we would say yes. Then the angel would further say, do you accept the divinity of the Holy Blessed One? And of course, each and every Israelite would say yes and yes. Immediately, the angel would kiss the Israelite on the mouth. This is what is meant by the scripture, you have been shown so as to comprehend. This is Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 35, Tahareta lada'at, which we might know from the introduction to the Torah service on Simchat Torah. So what is the experience according to Rabbi Yochanan of Revelation? God would speak holy words of Torah, and the angels would come around to us individually, would explain them to us, would teach them to us, so that every single soul, every one of our souls that was surrounding the mountain, was surrounding Sinai, would accept that revelation, would accept the divinity of God, would become a part of us and our responsibility to honor it, to hold it, to work with it, to understand it for the rest of our lives and the lives of future generations. And yet, even within this midrash in Shir HaShirim Rabbah, there's another interpretation of what happened in this moment of revelation. I'll read for you. And the rabbis say, the utterance itself would go about to each and every Israelite and say the same words that we just saw when they were coming from an angel, but now it's not the angel that's giving us the words of Torah. It's the words themselves. These living words of Torah would exit mipi hagvura, from the mouth of the divine, and they would enter into our ears, and they would say to us, do you accept me upon you? Such and such commandments are in me, and such rules are in me, and such penalties and such decrees are in me. Such and such rulings from minor to major are in me. Such and such granting of reward is in me. And the Israelites would say, yes and yes. Immediately the utterance would kiss the Israelite on the mouth and would teach the Torah to the Israelite. This is what is meant by the verse, lest you forget the things that your eyes saw, how the utterance spoke with you. So we have three different accounts of Revelation. I'll just recap briefly. We have our first in Sifrei Ha'azinu that describes the intimacy and the intensity with which God gathered us up in the desert and provided us with revelation. We have the second, that was the second text from Sifrei Ha'azinu. The first one, which tells us that there were no barriers, that each and every one of us heard Torah in our own way, and that all of the walls were brought down so that we could each have our own intimate, personal experience of revelation. And then we have this third account of revelation from Shaarey Rabbi, which tells us that an angel was our teacher, perhaps, and that each one of our souls accepted Torah, or perhaps the living words of God themselves exited the mouth of the divine and were spoken to each one of our ears, spoken to each one of our listening souls, and we accepted them. And so when we say V'ata hareta lada'at, you have been shown to know that each and every one of our souls has experienced Torah in this way and has accepted it. We have three different yet similar accounts of revelation. This is one of the beautiful things about our tradition, is that even within the Torah itself, we have multiple narratives of revelation. We have in the book of Exodus and the book of Deuteronomy, we have the giving of the Ten Commandments, and both of those givings of the Ten Commandments are different. They're described differently. The text is different. We have different words that are describing the mitzvot. And what does that tell us? That tells us that each and every one of us heard revelation in our own way, and each and every one of us can re-experience revelation in our own way. This opens us up to a pluralism and an openness of Jewish life, of different types of Jewish life, that maybe sometimes we're a little bit closed off to. But when we picture someone else's experience of Torah as a kiss from the divine, or as a kiss from an angel, or as having heard it from the mouth of God's self, well, then we have to look at it a little bit differently. I want to offer a fourth and final experience of revelation before we conclude. It's of course important to me that we hear women's voices when we think about holy moments. Unfortunately, for many generations, those voices were silenced. That room was not made for women's voices. And I want to share a poem about the moment of revelation by my teacher, Merle Feld, the honor of learning with a number of years ago. This is a poem that she wrote for Dr. Rachel Adler, a wonderful feminist Bible scholar and teacher. And the poem is called "We All Stood Together." And a very different approach to revelation. I would have loved to have included many, many more, but alas, our time is short and the work is great. So Merle Feld wrote, "My brother and I were at Sinai. He kept a journal of what he saw, of what he heard, of what it all meant to him. I wish I had such a record of what happened to me there. It seems like every time I want to write, I can't. I'm always holding a baby, one of my own, or one for a friend. Always holding a baby, so my hands are never free to write things down. And then, as time passes, the particulars, the hard data, the who, what, when, where, why, slip away from me. And all I'm left with is the feeling. But feelings are just sounds, the vowel barking of a mute. My brother is so sure of what he heard. After all, he's got a record of it. Consonant after consonant after consonant. If we remembered it together, we could recreate holy time, sparks flying. I love this poem so very much, not only because it's written by a teacher of mine, not only because it provides us with a woman's voice as we consider Revelation, but it really brings together everything that I want us to leave here with as we learn together in this moment. Too long have we pushed aside the other voices, the other memories of the souls that were there experiencing the moment of revelation. Too long have we held in our minds this notion that it happened in a particular way. We have the written account of Torah. We have the various, and which differ, which which do not speak in just one voice. We have many accounts of Revelation, as I read, from many different halachic midrashim and many agadic midrashim and many other sources as well. But we also have the experience that each and every one of our souls experienced. We have the experience of the ones who perhaps weren't able to write down what it was that they experienced. And that if we all put our heads together and we all put our hearts together and we all put our souls together, then perhaps, as the poem says, we could recreate this holy time. We could make the sparks fly once again. We could take the consonant after consonant after consonant and we can put them together with feelings and emotions and with deep-seated and deeply felt memories, and we could experience revelation in a completely different way. Because we celebrate this holiday of Shavuot, the giving of the Torah year after year after year. We read Torah year after year after year. And we don't do this just for the exercise of learning it. We do this for the exercise of relearning it, of re-embracing it, of trying to make sure that our souls really understand what it was that we were shown, what it was that we experienced in this moment of revelation. And that if there were no barriers, as the Midrash told us, and everyone experienced revelation in their own way, if we want the whole picture of what Torah is, we need everyone's voice. We need to hear everyone's experience. We need to open up our hearts and we need to open up our minds. So my homework for you this Shavuot is to talk to a friend, is to learn a new text, is to open yourself up to a new way of experiencing the divine, a new way of understanding the way that God speaks to us in this very day and age. And if we can put all those things together, if we can learn as much Torah as we can, and we can hear as many voices as we can, and we can experience the rebirth and regrowth that we experience this time of year as we head into the summer, then maybe Torah will speak to us in a different way, and maybe we can have the understanding, the intimacy, the knowledge of the divine in a way that we've never understood before. And that in my heart and that in my mind is what Shavuot is all about. So my final blessing that I'll leave you with is a Chag Sameach. It should be a joyful holiday and a joyful season, and it should be so joyful because we open up ourselves to the experience of revelation in new and interesting and meaningful and intimate ways.